When I first came to college, like many undergraduates before and since, I thought my whole life was planned out. I was to be a composer and a conductor of a major symphony orchestra. And so I came to college those first days with my scores under my arm and my baton in my hand, the latter a gift from a mother who was positively giddy at having the need to purchase a conducting baton for her teenage son. And I spent a lot of time in college playing music, recording music, performing music, conducting music. Hardly a weekend would go by when I wasn't playing in a concert or playing a gig with a band or having a piece premiered and performed. Usually there was more than one such event on a given weekend, and I started to collect all of the posters, and I would put them up on my wall, a growing monument to my own accomplishments, a parochially collegiate down payment on fame, on reputation that I was sure was going to come my way. Fortunately for me, I had a group of friends who cared more for me than they were impressed by me. And so they started to ask me questions about the aim, about the trajectory of my life, about what it was that I was after. And as they asked these questions, I started to realize, I said I was all about music, but there was something else that was really driving me. I was more interested in being famous than in being good. And I mean that in both senses. I mean, certainly I was more interested in fame than I was in being morally good, but I was more interested in fame than I was really concerned about how good the music was. And so, as time went by, I became convinced that wasn't worth living for. Fame, reputation, those things weren't worthy of being the aim of my life. And try as I might, I just couldn't disentangle my attachment to music and my passion for music from this attachment to reputation, to fame. And so I took the posters down off the wall and I retired the baton, and eventually I stopped writing music, or at least I stopped performing it publicly. And I have to say, I'm still not 100% sure whether that was the most courageous or the most cowardly decision of my life. But in those days, it was clear to me there was something unworthy of my humanity that had staked out a place as the aim of my life. And I felt I needed to do whatever I could to starve it. Unsurprisingly, shifting professional aspirations didn't magically kill off this attachment to reputation. As it turns out, self-obsession is actually rather portable. You can take it with you wherever you go, into whatever sort of pursuit you might take up. And so I discovered what I'm sure that you have already realized. My problem wasn't music. My problem was my posture toward it. But it was an important moment in my life to put a stake in the ground and say, no more. This isn't worthy of my humanity, and so it can't be the aim of my life. And these days, my life looks different than I had imagined. It does for most people. It looks different than what we imagine our lives will look like when we're young, when we're small. I spend my time convening and nurturing communities that do the sort of reflection that ruined, by which I mean saved, my life. And so I want to help us get a handle on exactly what sort of reflection this is. When I tell people that I teach a course called Life Worth Living, often the first thing that comes to people's minds is Socrates' dictum, the unexamined life is not worth living. And indeed, I'm all for examining our lives. But I take it that not all examination is created equal. If examination is significant, we need to ask ourselves, how should we examine our lives? And there are multiple answers to this question, many modes of examination, many habits of reflection, and this is as it should be. We need different modes of reflection at different times. Different of life's moments require different ways of reflecting, different questions to ask. The problem is, I'm not sure that we're very good these days at distinguishing between these different modes of reflection. And so today my goal is simple. I just want to disambiguate these seemingly synonymous questions to help us recover the most profound among them, because by ordering them properly, by putting the genuine question of the good life in its proper place, all of these questions find their place. And together, each of them can help us find our way to that life which is most truly worth living. So I want to describe to you 4 different modes of being in the world, 4 different ways of being in the world. And you need to hear this. No mode is bad in and of itself. All 4 of these modes need each other. And we experience these 4 as layers. That is, we generally move between adjacent layers. We don't skip around. As we move into deeper reflection, and we move into deeper layers. When we move toward action, and this too we must do, we move into higher layers. Each layer depends on the layers below it. That is, each layer depends on the answers to the questions that have been given at the layers below, even or especially when we haven't given those answers explicitly. And so if we haven't answered a question, nevertheless, everything we do, everything we say, everything we think shows evidence of some answer to this unanswered, deeper question. We live answers to the deep questions of life, even if we couldn't give those same answers if we were asked for them point blank. So the first surface layer is what I'll call the autopilot. This is the layer where we simply do what we do because that's what we do. When we're living only in this layer, we're not even sure of why we do what we do. Perhaps we're in a state of flow. We're deeply engaged in one or another embodied practice. At this layer, life is lived out of the sort of knowledge that lives in our muscles and in our bones. It lives in our bodies. The machinery of our lives, individually and collectively, just keeps churning, and we care not why. Much of life is lived here, up at the surface. And this is as it should be. In the best case scenario, what we do this way is finely tuned to give us the results that we want, and the results that we want are actually worth wanting. In this case, our autopilot reflects our deepest values, and indeed what is true independent of our values. If so, we're the sort of people whom Aristotle would call wise. He compares practical wisdom to that of a shipbuilder, except that in this case, instead of the thing that our hands knowing to do being building a ship, what our hands know to do, what our body, what our whole self knows to do is to build a good life. May all of us someday find ourselves in this situation. But a state of flow, a state of embodied practical wisdom isn't the only time when we do what we do simply because it's what we do. The autopilot runs our lives whenever we aren't all that reflective about our actions. This is the infamous unexamined life. So this layer can also be the one in which in our collective lives, say in an institution that we work for, our daily routine has no deeper justification than simply the answer, that's how we've always done it. And it doesn't take groupthink to start to think this way. We can just as well live this way all on our own. Cut off from deeper modes of reflection, this mode becomes a matter of mindless routine. The machine keeps churning, and we know nor really care why. This should be troubling to us. And in fact, we've probably all experienced this mode of living, this way that it can make us feel stuck and in desperate need of taking a step back and considering our habits. We know that feeling of relief when finally someone bursts into the room and says, well, hold on, is what we're doing actually getting us what we want? Or maybe the more pragmatic version of the diagnostic question, it would be, how can we get more of what we want? Whichever form it takes, this is the effectiveness question. And this is the heart of all the design thinking that's so in vogue these days. And if the autopilot isn't getting us where we want to go, it's a great relief when finally this question appears on the scene. We're able to step back and to reflect on our actions and consider whether they're really getting us what we're after. For organizations, this can be a watershed moment in which our daily routines are centered and tuned around our goals. There's a helpful ruthlessness within this layer. That's how we've done it, just no longer cuts it as an answer, as a justification. New processes are designed, new practices are cultivated. If we're doing it right, reflection at this layer streamlines our daily routines and directs our energies. As a team, we then say, we're now pulling all in the same direction. After a season invested in reflection in this layer, we can switch back to autopilot with the knowledge that our new habits will yield the results that we're after. Now, the disadvantage of this layer of reflection is that it's what a philosopher might call ends agnostic. That is, there's nothing here that's concerned with whether the goals that we have are the right goals, or even frankly, whether they're our goals. An efficient system gets you more of what you want, whatever it is. And that can actually be dangerous if you haven't thought all that hard about what it is that you're after. I mean, think about it. An effective strategy for focusing exclusively on your professional goals at the expense of the relationships that are most significant to you, that effective strategy is actually worse for you than an ineffective one. If your ends are bad, then more effective means is hardly the solution. Now, I give that example, and it sounds ridiculous, but the fact is that many of us live our lives never going much deeper than these top two layers. The effectiveness question strikes us as the most insightful question that there is. And we marvel at those who are able to master it. Silicon Valley captivates our collective imagination because its firms churn out products and services that can do anything. They are masters of effectiveness. In fact, I take it a great lie of the 21st century is that the effectiveness question is the most profound question that we can ask. The truth is closer to this. These days, the effectiveness question is the most profound question many of us can answer. But most of us have experienced here and there in our lives a yet more significant question. A question that can save us from the ends agnosticism of lives lived only in the effectiveness layer. And that is the question, what do we really want? I mean, it's all well and good to know how to get more of what we want, but the more important question is, what are we really after? Where are we really trying to go? This is the self-awareness question. A question that invites us into a process of introspection. From the hustle and bustle of the autopilot and the strategic tuning of life in the effectiveness question, we arrive at a quieter place, looking inward. We stop being distracted by what's most easily accomplished and instead ask what it is that we really want. Rather than valuing what's most easily measured, what's most easily demonstrated to be effective, we take stock of what it is that we truly value most. And the deeper we probe here, the more we apply this question recursively, asking again and again, what do we want? What do we really want? What are we really after? The more we come to realize that what we want isn't just a set of discrete things or discrete outcomes or even a set of character traits. What we want is actually more holistic than that. What we want is what we're chasing after, what our lives are aimed at, is some vision of a good life, some vision of flourishing life. The sort of life that we want for ourselves, that we want for our children or other young people whom we care about, the sort of life that we want to make possible for our world as a whole to live in. Of course, that vision is capacious. When I say a vision of flourishing life, I don't mean a life that specifies every little detail of a life. I mean the broad strokes. I mean what it is that we imagine when we imagine life led well, a life going well, a life feeling like it should. And even at the level of the broad strokes, though, this vision still entails choices. And at this level, at this layer, the choices are ours. Do we want a life of ecstatic joy or a life of peaceful serenity? Perhaps what we want is a life lived with courage, or rather a life perhaps that leaves room for the other. Maybe we treasure a life of abundant provision, or perhaps a life that has just enough. Do we prize a life of independence, or rather a life of interdependence? Choices abound, and at this level, the choices are ours. For this reason, the self-awareness level can actually be a lonely place. As we probe the depths of our own intuitions, our own preferences, there is no escaping the fact that these visions and our reasons for preferring them are our own. Even when we do this sort of reflection together with a community in a group, we come to realize that our collective vision, whatever it is, our collective vision is inescapably ours. It may not be compelling to those on the outside, no matter how compelling it is to us. And yet, if we want to live with integrity, we will need to orient the rest of life, our strategies and our habits, around this vision of life toward which we're oriented. That is, the task in this layer is to explicitly orient our lives around that which our lives were already oriented implicitly. But even in the midst of a substantially actualized self-awareness, many of us have experienced the dissatisfaction that can creep in. This is the feeling that comes in moments of mid- and quarter-life crises. Many of my undergraduates actually arrive in my classroom already in a moment of quarter-life crisis. They've spent years trying to put together the sorts of resumes that are going to get them into the college of their dreams. And then they arrive on campus and they look around, and first of all, they see a whole bunch of other people who also managed to get into this locked door, get through this locked door, find their way into this good life. And second, they're wondering, wait, shoot, is this it? Is this all that I was working for? What now? Where do I aim my efforts? And whether or not we've been in this place ourselves, we know someone who has. And when it comes down to it, we have the sneaking suspicion that if our lives go as we want them to, these are actually ironically privileged places, privileged problems. But if our lives go as we want them to, we will land in this place eventually. This is the place where we have a life oriented around getting us what we want, and in large part we have it, and yet there's still something missing. And asking the effectiveness question doesn't help. In fact, the ruthlessness with which we've pursued our chosen vision of the good life seems itself to be part of the problem. And asking the self-awareness question won't help either. I mean, we could try to apply recursively the lesson that we learned in the self-awareness level, asking recursively again and again, what do I want? What do I really want? What do I really, really, really want? But that quickly becomes a never-ending loop of introspective navel-gazing. The answer, sadly, is not within. The fact is, we wouldn't be where we are if we didn't really want whatever it is that we have now found wanting. No, the only question suited to these moments, the question with which we ought to familiarize ourselves sooner rather than later, lest we maroon our lives on the reef of effectively actualized self-awareness. That question is not what do we want, but rather what is worth wanting. And this is a question hardly ever whispered in many corners, much less posed in all earnestness. Here we have entered the layer of SelfTranscendence. And if the self-awareness question pointed you to a vision of a good life that oriented your life, your compass, set your trajectory, and the effectiveness question asked you about the reliability of your strategy in delivering the goods of that life to you, then the self-transcendence question asks you about the validity of that vision. It asks you, is this vision in fact worthy of my humanity? This question asks you, is that vision of a good life, that vision of life that you want for yourself, your children, your community, is that vision true? Is your vision of a good life, in fact, a vision of the true life? Has your compass properly identified true north? In the language of desire, we would say, is what you really want actually worth wanting? The self is no longer at the center of our quest. We are no longer the point. In fact, quite the opposite. This question aims to push us out of the center. And at these depths, the name of the game is Normative Inquiry, the erstwhile realm of theology and philosophy. And actually, I take it that every humanities course you ever took should have, at least in part, been about helping you learn to ask and begin to answer this question. My hunch is that a number of literature classes probably did do that for you. In dealing with questions of truth, we have to learn a different strategy, a different posture towards the world, a different mode of reflection. And the good news is that if the self-awareness question led us into sort of isolation, then in the self-transcendence layer, we find that we are not so alone after all. Here, others are again in view, for the question that we ask in this layer has to do with them as well. In fact, we may find that these others are actually sort of troublesome because we have to contend with one another about the answers that we give, about the claims that we make to the truth. Even while we seek the truth, even the universal truth, we know that our own claims are, in fact, particular. Not everyone comes to the conclusions that we do. And if we don't attend well to this particularity and pursue charity in our contestation with one another over the shape of our lives and over the truth of our claims about the vision of life that we're aiming for, then our expeditions to this depth will have yielded nothing more than mere ideology. But it's not just our contemporaries that come into view at this level. The ancients reappear as well. When we begin to ask normative questions about the good life, we find that while we're perhaps in uncharted territory for ourselves, we're actually right in the thick of a conversation about the nature of flourishing life that has been going on for thousands of years. And so Moses and Plato and Confucius and the Buddha and Jesus, the Prophet Muhammad, to say nothing of more recent thinkers from Mary Wollstonecraft to Nietzsche to James Baldwin, all these voices have been asking this question: what is worth wanting, long before we stumbled upon it? And actually, where theologians and philosophers have faltered, often it is artists who have picked up the slack. Now, whoever we're interacting with, whoever we're reading, whoever's work we're considering, whoever's way of life we're encountering, these folks' answers probably can't simply be our answers. That would be to ignore the question of self-awareness to which we'll have to attend on our way back up to the surface. But their answers can help us, the ways that they pose the questions perhaps even more so. And in their and in one another's presence, we will find that the question of the truth of the good life can be posed and begun to be answered in all seriousness. Now, after we have plumbed these depths, there is still a return voyage to be made. Apprehending the truth of the matter does us no good if we don't appropriate this truth as our own. The truth of self-transcendence needs to become the vision of self-awareness. And any work that we do at these deeper layers remains just esoteric knowledge unless we have effective strategies to implement what we've learned in our daily lives. Our lives can only ever be lived so intentionally, so we need practices that can give expression to our insights. What we've learned with our minds needs to be inscribed in our bodies. Indeed, minds and bodies aren't so simply related that way. We're actually going to need to take lots of these different dives. Like many processes, this is one that we're, I think, going to want to repeat. And sometimes on some of these dives, what we're going to want to reflect on underneath the water is whether our practices up above the surface aren't actually smarter than some of our best ideas. And often returning to the surface will feel just like that. A return to a place where we can breathe. While it would be foolish never to go under the water and to probe even the depths of the water, it would be equally foolish to try to live our whole lives underneath the water's surface. Such life, as you might imagine, can feel suffocating. But if we learn to take these dives with some regularity, dives of different depths, no doubt, but dives that never neglect the deepest waters entirely. If we're able to learn to do all three of these modes of reflection and through them encounter the fundamental question of our lives: what is worth wanting? What life is in fact worthy of our humanity? Then we may indeed find our way, individually and collectively, into flourishing life.